Hello class, welcome to this week's mini lecture. So the topic for today will be light and color. And obviously the book explores much more about light and color. So obviously make sure that you are reading the chapter fully and taking the quiz every week. It looks like everyone's doing pretty great so far. But this lecture here are going to be our learning objectives. So first we're going to describe the ways in which artists use light to represent space and model form. And to get at this, we're going to actually be talking about a few key terms, one being chiaroscuro, and then modeling, as well as tenebrism and aerial perspective. The second kind of objective of this short lecture will be to talk about drawing and how drawing creates value. And to get at this, we'll look at a technique called hatching and cross-hatching. So to begin with light and color are elements that affect the creation of space in art. And I'd really like to start talking about light and color, as does your textbook, by thinking about the artist Dan Flavin. He transformed the spaces of his galleries and rooms with fluorescent colored lights, and he started doing this kind of work early on in his career. So this was around 1961, in the middle of the 20th century. And then we're going to talk about an artist who was very much influenced by Dan Flavin, a Venezuelan artist, Carlos Cruz Diaz. And he did very much the same thing as Dan Flavin, but did some things a little bit differently. And we'll look at his work, chromosaturation, in which the artist divided the gallery into 3 different chambers and filled them with 3 different colors of light. So red, green, and blue. And we'll check that out in just a second. But first I wanted to start at the Dan Flavin Art Institute. This is located in New York. It used to be a church house, but then it was bought by the artist in around the 60s, and it was actually open all the way until the 80s, and funded by the Dia Foundation. So basically, if you go inside of the space, and you can see from the outside that you basically can tell that there's some interest in light here. And so what the artist has done is not so much, painted the gallery walls inside to be, if you look in the door, you see that green. Up on the window, you see yellow and blue. So what's actually happening here is that the artist is actually using fluorescent lights to fill those spaces with particular colors, and then that is the color that we see reflected off the white walls. So if we go inside of these spaces, this is kind of an example of what you might see. So for instance, here you have the artist using circled fluorescent neon lights in his work, lining them up, stacking them on top one another, and then letting them kind of infiltrate the space with this kind of yellow light. And then as you can see here, he's put kind of a blue screen over the window, which also changes the way that the light escapes and enters the space. And this is much more kind of, this is kind of a better example of what's going on in these spaces, and this is a very good example of Flavin's work. So you can see here, and if you recall from last week when we talked about the grid, we have a typical grid being used here, but what's actually going on? Well, as you can see if you look closely, these bars are actually bars that have fluorescent lights attached to them. And there's a variety of colors here. We've got some oranges, reds, and then yellows at the bottom. And then you can see on the other side, stacked right behind these bars, we also have another presumably set of fluorescent lights that face in the opposite direction, which are most likely blues and greens, as you can see from the light reflected off these 2 walls. So this is very typical of Flavin's work. And if we were to walk around this corner, we would see also here, there's likely a piece that has a lot of green neon lights over here. And then as we walk down this hallway, we see more orange, kind of in warmer colors that we see at the end of the hallway. And if you want to hear more about warmer colors, I'm not going to put a specific lecture about that on Blackboard, but your book does spend a good amount of time talking about that. And now I wanted to show you a short clip, actually, just to get you thinking about this piece, about Flavin's work. So let's go ahead and watch this. All right, so I just wanted to show that to you quickly, and then we'll get back to our PowerPoint here. So what do you guys think about that? I mean, it's hard because I can't actually ask you right now, but I talked about this piece with my class earlier today when I was giving a lecture. And what's actually happening here? Well, the light, he's using fluorescent light again. This is nothing new for Dan Flavin. This interactive piece was actually created after he already had passed, but it's been repositioned in this gallery space as an interactive piece. But what actually happens here is the woman, as she enters this space, she puts her hand close to one of the lights, and it reads her closeness. So it reads movement, and it also reads warmth, which is kind of cool. And so as she moves between the three different lights, they kind of react to her in different ways as she uses the heat of her body and also the movement of her body to kind of inform the way that the work functions. So this is a really great thing, and it's really kind of an exciting development that happens for contemporary artists, basically beginning in the 70s, 60s and 70s, and even more so in the 80s and 90s, where we have artists who are interested in interactivity and having the spectator or the viewer be an active part of the work, who informs the work in certain ways. So this is something that's kind of new and exciting, relatively new if we think about, the broader scope of art history. And then Carlo Cruz Diaz is another one of these artists who follows in Flavin's footsteps with his current work, Chromosaturation. And this work is from 2012. You can see here a photo of, the space itself. So the work is not necessarily the photograph, right? It's actually the space itself, and this is just a document of the space, the photograph, okay? So if we were to move into the space, as we can see, there's three different chambers that have been divided. The central chamber that we're in now is red, and then we have a blue chamber and a green chamber on the sides. And you can see how the artist is interested in the color hues that are created between the two rooms as the light mixes. So this is really kind of interesting, right? You see the blue kind of turns to purple and then to pink and then to red. And then over here we have green turning into yellow, orange, and then finally into red. And so we really have this whole scope of the kind of the color wheel that comes out in this work. And then I wanted to do a quick experiment with you guys to think more about this work. So I'll ask you now to look at the circle with the three colors on the left side of the screen. Now gaze at that black dot right in the middle, and we're going to actually look at that for about 20 seconds. You might start to think that you're seeing some movement or something. All right, so that's been 20 seconds. Now look directly on the center of the white block of emptiness on the other side. What do you see? So it's likely that you see color there. You probably see pink on the bottom, yellow on the left side, and then blue on the right side. And so this is kind of your retina creating an after image. And maybe you've already done this experiment before in school, but this is basically the reason I like to do this at this point in the class is to kind of show you how your retina actually has to take time to when you move from space to space and when you see things all around you, that your retina has to take time to make a transition, okay? Especially when you're seeing these bright colors and for instance here you're really gazing at those colors and you're trying hard to concentrate on them. So when you're actually looking at something like this, your retina certainly, your eyes, they take a little bit of time to transition. And so this is something that the artist is really interested in here. So Cruz Diaz, as you can see, as you move from room to room, so here's another a view of it. So this would be, we would be coming from the green side over here looking this way. So you can see here that these people walked through it, and you can imagine that as you were walking through the space, if you'd spent a little bit of time in the green room, and then when you walk to the red room, obviously, as we've just shown with our little experiment, there would be some sort of a moment of transition that would have to happen for your eyes, and this would kind of be a kind of an experience that you'd have would be part of the work as well. Finding that transition between space that not only is spatial but also is full of color and full of light. So now when we think more about light, we can also think more broadly about natural light and how artists more traditionally have used light in their work. So natural light often helps to define spatial relationships. It often helps us to define what is in the foreground and what is in the background. Artists can control the experience of their work through the manipulation of light. That is to say, artists can decide how we see and how we read the work by how they use the light. So Leonardo da Vinci is one of these artists who was very concerned with writing the rules for what we call atmospheric or aerial perspective. So basically when objects are farther away, they will appear less distinct, sometimes bluer in color, and they'll usually have reduced light or dark contrast. So let's take a look at this. So this is one of Leonardo da Vinci's most important pieces, Madonna of the Rocks. Here you see three groups of rocks with differing distances, marked only by atmospheric perspective. So if you see here, the rocks in the foreground are very clear, right? They're very clear, they're brown in color, and they seem to kind of pop out at us. And then here behind the figures, we've got more rocks that are a little bit more distant, right? They definitely signify a foreground of sorts, but they are receding in the back of these rocks right in the foreground here. And then as we move back, we have another set of rocks that are kind of a greenish tint, and they become slightly blurry, so we can tell that they are receding in space. And then finally our eye is drawn all the way to the back where we see these these bluish hued rocks, which also draws our eye back, and this is the perfect example here of atmospheric or aerial perspective. We also see atmospheric perspective happening in the work of J.M.W. Turner. He was an artist really interested in speed and the railroad, okay? And we won't talk about him too much now, but he was a member of the Romantic movement, but we'll get there later near the end of the course. But he's basically doing something really important here with atmospheric perspective. But it's important to note that he also uses linear perspective. So if you recall from the last week, we talked a lot about linear perspective. So remember that we talked about a vanishing point, which would be at the center right here where the arrow is placed. And then we have these kind of orthogonals, right? These lines that come towards the front, but they meet at a vanishing point in the back. We've also got a bridge over at the side, again with an orthogonal, which leads us back to that same exact point, so we know that the artist is using linear perspective correctly. So as our eye is drawn back, we also see the use of atmospheric perspective here. So we have light and atmosphere begin to obscure the train tracks near the center of the work and then create kind of a sense of um, airiness, right? And the artist would actually write about this work um, as having a sense of spirituality, okay? Even though we might not see that in the work necessarily, that's kind of how the work would be read by the artist. But here we do have the use of atmospheric perspective because we have the blurring of the lines almost to complete abstraction as we move back to the back of the page. When we talk about value, it's also important to talk about the important terms that we should be using here. So relative value of lightness or darkness of an area or object is traditionally called relative value. Relative level of lightness. I misspoke. And when white is added to a basic hue or a color, the variation is called a tint. On the other edge of the sword, we have black. When it's used as and added to a basic hue, we call this variation a shade. For example, pink is the tint of red, right? Because we add white to red to create pink, and maroon is a shade of red. Why? Because we add black to red to make maroon. So here's a nice kind of example of these two scales. So we have a gray scale here, and as we have black at the top, if we add white to it, we have tints, right? All the way down to white, we go through a gray scale. And then on the other side of that, we have white, and as we add black, we also get a gray scale, but these would be called shades moving up to that definite black at top. Same goes for the blue range of values here. So there's a couple terms I also wanted to bring up just to make sure to emphasize from your textbook. One is chiaroscuro and the other is modeling. These are very, very similar terms, and you'll see they're often used interchangeably, okay? So chiaroscuro, it's an Italian term. It refers to the balance of light and shade in a work, most often exhibited when the artist transitions from light to dark around a curved surface. And I love to use the Mona Lisa for this because especially around the curve of her face here, and between kind of her neck and the bottom of her chin, you really see a lot of this beautiful chiaroscuro, which is again this kind of balancing of light and dark in the work, and this beautiful kind of blending of lights and dark, which we also might call modeling. Okay. Here's another great example of modeling in Paul Collins' work. So here we've got kind of beige paper that was used. And the shadow and the light are indicated by using a black and a white crayon, so not just a dark crayon, but also a light crayon. And we see how highlights are really important here. The use of the white crayon on the forehead shows us where the light is hitting the subject. So we know right away that the light is probably coming from the upper right corner of the piece, falling down on the subject's face, and then we have obviously the highlights to kind of show us where the light hits, and then we have the darker areas around the edges, a type of modeling, or what you might also call chiaroscuro. Now, another term that I like to bring up this week when we talk about modeling and contrast is tenebrism. Tenebrism is a technique separate from modeling, in which the areas of dark contrast sharply with smaller, brightly illuminated areas. So this is different from chiaroscuro because within chiaroscuro we have kind of a blending of the lights and darks to create this kind of sensation of modeling around a round figure, okay? But here with tenebrism we have a much more dramatic contrast between lights and darks, and we often have this within Baroque period paintings, like we see here on the right side. This work is by Artemisia Gentileschi. She was also an Italian artist, but she was interested in tenebrism, and many of her colleagues were at this time, because one of the things about Baroque art is that there's a lot of intensity in the subject matter in Baroque art, but also in the lighting. So here we have a very kind of dramatic, intense event happening. These two women have just slayed Holofernes. They've just cut off a man's head. Okay, this is very dramatic. But then also we also have the lighting, which also mimics that drama. Okay, so how do you see tenebrism in this piece? Well, you can see here there's often a use of a candle in paintings that use tenebrism, because that's really how you're going to see the lightest contrast between lights and darks. I'm sorry, the brightest contrast. Strongest, I guess, would be a better term for it. So you see here she puts her hand in front of the candle, and then she blocks it from her face. So if you look to her face, you have an amazing example here of tenebrism, which is this, again, high contrast of lights and darks. And then also I'd like to point out her maidservant, her headdress here, her kind of uh, fabric headdress. You can see the folds create really high contrast between lights and darks, and this is basically because of that kind of light of the candle, which reflects onto her face and onto that head wrap, where we see an obvious contrast between lights and darks. And then the last thing I wanted to mention in this lecture is hatching and cross-hatching. So we're going to be having a final assignment at the end of this course where we actually, some of you will do a drawing. So you'll have to create an art piece, and some of you will choose to do a drawing. And so hopefully this will help you, if you're not a person who has much experience in drawing, perhaps this will help you to kind of think through the ways that you can start drawing if you choose to do that. So hatching is an area of closely spaced parallel lines, and as you can see here, the whole back of this figure is hatching. These are just lines that are used to create value, okay? And oftentimes they render depth and shadow within the room. So you can see the contours of her body here, the line of her back. Everything behind it is much more darkly cross-hatched, and that is to create kind of a sense of depth. And this is basically what crotch hatching is. And I did this exercise with my students in class today, but I can't really do it with you necessarily. But we all drew it out in our notebook. We drew how hatching and cross hatching. We made a couple boxes and then we kind of went through the exercise together. But really, if you start with 4 boxes, and you can try this at home, you just draw lines vertically across the page. And then the next square, you draw vertical and horizontal lines. The next square, I want you to draw vertical, horizontal, and then diagonal lines starting at the left. And then the last square, I want you to do all of this. So the horizontal, the vertical, the diagonal from the left, and then I want you to add the diagonal from the right. And then squint at your drawing, or squint at this PowerPoint, and notice how you see the value getting darker, little by little. So this is how cross-hatching works, okay? And we see here really an amazing example of cross-hatching by Michelangelo. And you can see there's the darker parts of this drawing. This is simply a drawing using pen and ink and on paper. And I think there's chalk involved too, most likely Conte crayon if you're familiar. But you can see all the dark areas here are not actually like, filled in with color, but rather they've just been cross-hatched to such a high degree that there's so little space between the crosses, between the cross-hatching, that you hardly even see the color of the paper behind it. So this is very common kind of use, especially with these drawings that we're looking at today. And if you look down, you see his chin is just a series of cross-hatchings in different directions, his neck, and then the hair itself also becomes kind of just these kind of wild sets of cross-hatching. And so that's all that I have for you today. That's all I really wanted to go over in this mini lecture. I'll also be posting another mini lecture on Thursday to kind of give you a little bit more of an emphasis from the chapter you're supposed to be reading, the second chapter you're supposed to be reading this week. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I will talk to you on Thursday.